Hello, welcome again to Chile Talk, which is being recorded on a phone due to technical problems here in Santiago, Chile. I'm, of course, Neil Davidson, and I'm with Pete Leihy. And today we thought we would talk about property, real estate. What exactly were we going to talk about?
Well, we're focusing in on perhaps looking for a new house in Santiago.
Which I happen to be doing at the moment, okay?
Yes, and this is part of a general series that we've got planned. We often plan series and sometimes don't follow through with them.
That's a fair criticism.
Yes, but in this case we've covered different aspects of geography and what we call urbanismo.
Which is town planning in
Yes.
English speakers.
Which is, in a seismic country like Chile, is always interesting. Also taste-wise, here in Latin America, there's, like other places, there's a bit of a tendency to knock down the nice and replace it with the new.
There certainly is. I mean, I always, looking at some pictures of places in the United States, recently, I kind of thought, it looks like the third world, Well, no, what it is the third world looks like the United States, right? The kind of causality works in the opposite direction. Or like, British, the stuff that was built in Britain on bomb-damaged sites after the Second World War, like the City of London. So that's the kind of thing, it's like higgledy-piggledy. You knock down a row of like nice old houses and just put up any old block of flats, whatever, And then there's the big thing of gated community. I mean, just the kind of layout of Santiago very briefly. So you have the old centre, which is still the centre, and it's the commune of Santiago, and it's on the river Mapocho, which isn't much of a river, but it provides a kind of landmark. And that's the original city, and it extends from. It's still the centre because it's got the presidential palace, the government offices, and all the things you would expect to be associated with them. And then a lot of poor people, because essentially people with money don't live in the centre, and nor is it wholly commercial and political. There's a lot of residents, but they tend to be now immigrants. Similar pattern you see in Spain as well, I think, old area quarters of Barcelona, often inhabited by quite poor immigrants, and the Spanish, if they can, living in nice new houses with carports.
Well, I was just in Madrid, for example, and the centre there is becoming very expensive after having a strong working class heritage. It's too expensive now.
So that's directly contradicting what I'm saying. Is that residential expensive?
Residential, yes. Yes. So these are cycles that happen. First, you get what in the United States they call white flight. Yeah. People moving out with the railroad, with the commuter.
And then it becomes fashionable to live in the kind of inner city again.
The gentrification,
which we saw in London, which was losing population. Well, of course, immigration's transformed it, but well, that's it. So you have the centre, and then there's the actual centre where the government offices are, and then the other old part is to the west of that, towards the coast a bit, and there's quite a lot of very nice old stuff there. I think for the simple reason that when the people with money left and they moved up east, further and further up the slopes towards the mountains, it just wasn't worthwhile demolishing. It was rather like Havana, I think. There were just no property developers waiting to demolish people's houses and build lots of flats because it's where poor people lived.
Yes, well, I mean, the area, places like República, like Yungay, as the name Yungay would suggest, from the First War with Peru and Bolivia in the 1830s. This was a mid-19th century expansion, and it was the new uptown, the new Barrio Alto, and would have been a very nice one at the time. A similar thing happened in Buenos Aires. People moved down towards the river in the mid-19th century, not the big river, the smaller river, whose name I cannot remember.
Me neither. Okay, we'll leave it in advance.
and they moved down there. Then, when yellow fever struck, particularly in the war in Paraguay, people moved from the river, in the Argentine case, further towards the north, through Palermo, which was quite a working class area, up to Belgrano and beyond there. In the Chilean case, what happened, for various reasons, there was yellow fever and other typhoid and other things. Eventually, people began to move at the end of the 19th century to Providencia, which became...
Which is to the east, again slightly uphill.
Yes, which was the first really municipality beside Santiago. So the historic centre, immediately to the east of that, Providencia, which had been farms, the farms of politicians, for example. The family city farm would be there for the weekend, and the more serious farm would be, somewhere else, the old ancestral lands. That turned into a suburb around about 1900. So from 1897, Providencia was a comuna, so its own municipality, and from there, further sites were added gradually.
And have continued to be added, so now you get up to La Dehesa, which is really quite high up indeed. And you look down on the city and on the smog, which I assume was one of the reasons for people to leave the centre, because it's pretty bad. And the higher uphill, of course, you go, the better. And so now you can continue heading east for quite a long way, and you're getting into quite opulent, going through quite opulent suburbs. It must be said that the centre, the old part, Barrio República, let's say Yungay, you've got places like Conchitoro, which are absolutely lovely. They're kind of classically inspired or French inspired a lot of the time, but with a kind of indefinable Chilean touch, which is really, really rather beautiful. And then Providencia, clearly a different era, as you say, turn of the 20th century.
But that Providencia barely exists today. That original sort of suburban part has almost exclusively gone, and some of the later expansion from the 1940s, 1960s is also increasingly disappearing and being replaced by tower blocks, which brings greater density of population, but strangely, not much more life.
There's a strange lack of kind of shopping facilities and things in a lot of Providencia.
Or entertainment, or anywhere in Santiago, to be honest.
So there you have it. They have. These places, but it was lovely. Clearly you see old photographs, and it's like Buenos Aires. It's heartbreakingly beautiful, and it's heartbreaking because it's been so badly smashed up. But there is something left.
But some of the areas beside Providencia are reasonably well preserved. So the place to the east of that, Las Condes, has some urban renewal style misguidance, but also some very nice stuff from when that was the Barrio Alto uptown. And in Ñuñoa, where we're actually shooting today, just to the south of Providencia, there is a really a great integrity of architecture.
That's right. In this area where we are now, that's right.
Yes, often the original constructions from the 1940s to 1960s, 70s.
That's right. It's kind of not a square mile, perhaps not even a square kilometre, but it's a reasonable size, area. And then you got due east from here. There's La Reina, which is pretty dull.
That had a big army camp and
right.
Air Force camp, and as such was
aerodrome.
Was an orderly place, but for the working class people who worked for the armed forces.
That's right. The house we're shooting in is a Ley Pereira Act. I don't know exactly what year that was, but it kind of mandated a type of house for the modest middle classes, which is a beautiful type of house, or generally sort of white, sort of big chimneys. I'm not very good at describing sort of neoclassical, fluted. I'm actually just looking out the window here. Fluted kind of columns by the doors, really lovely, and now quite desirable and expensive, as is the case in so many places with what were once modest middle class or working class houses, have now, despite decades of supposedly continuous economic progress, have become very desirable and expensive.
We also haven't mentioned much of Chile throughout the 20th century was basically settled by people coming in from the countryside and setting up what became known as callampas, mushroom settlements that seemed to come up overnight with not many services, just taking over basically farmland that wasn't particularly well supervised, or other opportunities to move in. And gradually over time, different government programs would seek to formalise the housing. Also the church, during the agricultural reform, went to great lengths to try to organise some of the land that it was required to give up to people.
That's right. There's a certain advantage here, which is that, in a kind of European city, if you can't afford anywhere to live, then you're a bit stuck. I mean, you might be able to get some government, emergency housing or something. But the nice thing about Latin America is you can always just go and build a shanty town, and you can still do that. They've got rid of almost all the shanty towns here.
They've come back in fashion in the last few years. Partly
they were enormous 20 years ago. Even they were huge shanty towns, But yeah, you were saying, Pete.
Well, yeah, partly it has to do with the immigration. Some of the immigrants are moving into basically squatting on land and laying claim.
And there's always another hillside somewhere you can build your housing on. So I'm sort of grinning away. It's like it must be pretty terrible. You've got children and stuff.
And there are sort of semi-legal aspects to this. If you stake things out,
it will probably regular. At some point, it may well be regularised. They're not just going to clear off, because human rights, do count for a lot here actually, and so they're not just going to clear out, a few thousand people and sort of turn them out into the fields. They will probably actually end up regularising your settlement. So in a way, it's easier here than somewhere like London. You can do that. And then the rest of Santiago, because we think of the centre, Providencia, Nuñoa, these places, and then there's Vitacura in the east, also pretty dull, but a lot of prosperous people, and then you've got San Damian, La Dehesa.
Because in that direction, it's more your modern
gated communities.
Very Latino.
Very people who have literally never in their whole lives been to the centre. It just doesn't exist for them. And that is the Santiago of people like us, like reasonably well-heeled people. And then, of course, most people live in this much larger area of the city. There's La Florida, which is the new middle class, decent housing, but sort of people who are less well-heeled. And then you go out and you've got places like San Miguel, and you've got the whole of South Santiago, which is pretty enormous, and which people like us simply never go to because we're afraid to, especially now.
Although much of San Miguel was set up for the original middle classes, who were people who had jobs that required them to read, so things like bank clerks, teachers, didn't have much money but did have a salary, and often a bank, which might be a state-backed bank, would actually set up a community for people to live in, with certain infrastructure and facilities. So that is quite a nice area. I've been there, and it's nice as those sort of areas often are.
I have literally never been, so I was quite ill-informed when I said that people like us don't go there. You've been there.
Well, we're not exactly the same, Neil.
Right.
People like us is a Spanish phrase, gente como uno. People like oneself.
And an English phrase,
yes,
in England.
Yes, and certainly the way it's used in Spanish is in very poor taste usually. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, you're seeing the slightly improvisatory quality of these talks we have. But spontaneity, honesty, ignorance.
We're not on Zoom. Yes,
that's right. And have you been to Cerrillos? Now, my daughter went to Cerrillos to visit somebody.
Yes, I have visited.
Because there's now a museum of modern art there on what used to be an aerodrome, which I have been to because I acted in a film there once when there was a kind of film studio of sorts there. But that's my only visit, and that's where the museum is. And now people live there, and again, it's one of these places that you never think about. But perhaps you think about it all the time, Pete. You think,
Well, I like all these areas, especially if they're reasonably well planned or retrospectively planned. So after in the the 1940s, when Chile was doing reasonably well, prior to the economy collapsing in the early 1950s, there was quite a bit of urbanisation in places like Recoleta, which is immediately to the north of Santiago.
And it strikes you because it has a lot of churches. And newer areas seem to have almost no visible churches at all. Yes. And the ones they do have are actually kind of these modern Catholic ones, which are kind of rather grey,
Well, of course, Recoleta is a church-operated part of the Spanish city. It's usually where the cemetery is.
That's right. Yeah, the general cemetery and lovely churches, huh? Really beautiful.
And that part of Santiago always had people living there in informal ways from the colonial period on the north bank of the Mapocho. But after World War II, certainly Independencia and Recoleta were formally organised, and a lot of new housing was built that was very consistent. Often very good architects were arriving from Europe to assist with the planning, and they made some very nice houses, not entirely dependent on the traditional stucco, do we say, adobe, almost wattle and daub construction, which is very energy efficient in terms of insulation, but unfortunately falls down in earthquakes.
That's right. Especially when it gets a bit old.
So it's uninsurable in Chile by and large. It's very hard to get a bank loan to buy.
That's right, an adobe house. So just to go back briefly. So I mean, I've mentioned, because what I was going to say is to people like me at least, Santiago feels like quite a small city, simply because I only frequent certain areas, which is the central sort of core, really. So it's not, even that is not that small. There are quite a lot of people who are like reasonably prosperous. It's not a desperately poor city at all. There are these other very large areas, and I always thought of San Miguel as representing a very large poor area that one would never go to. So I mean, just briefly describe it physically. What kind of, is it houses? Lots of cars?
Well, there is this housing that comes from really the 1920s, which has a uniformity to it because it's often built in kind of planned communities. Has infrastructure in terms of public transport. It's not
no metro, so you have to get the bus.
Yes, it began as a middle class for a country that had no middle class prior to the early 20th century, and today it's middle class. It's the middle of the middle class. We have a very large middle class that looks a lot like a working class, but we call it a middle class because Chileans are very conscious about not being in the very lower part of society. And somewhere like San Miguel would be 60 to 70 percentile sort of income, maybe even higher these days. It's quite nice. Now,
I had no idea. You see, I clearly chose the wrong example for this kind of. There's this kind of grey cement expanse, enormous in South Santiago.
There's a bit of that. There's quite a bit of that as well. But unfortunately, Neil, your blinkered view is going to come to bear in an upcoming episode, probably the next one, where we talk about your own personal struggle
for personal fulfilment in what is the only true personal fulfilment an Englishman knows, which is acquiring property. I'm looking for a house to buy,
and you're looking perhaps not in the whole city.
Not in the whole city, indeed. No.
So we'll have a look at that in the next one.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us on this fairly disorganised ramble around Santiago. I hope you find it of some interest, and see you next time.